And we had to learn, I think, as a couple, to respect each other's differences and to work through that and understand that neither one of us was wrong in how we were grieving, but we had to realize it, try to work it so that as we were expressing our grief, we weren't making the other one worse.
Everything you do from then on is different.
One of the detectives, I think his name was
He was
Derek.
a golden boy.
All we can do right now is come together.
Extreme domestic violence, multiple rapes.
So glad to have you on life support. And what we're going to do today is interview a very special guest in an effort to once again see God enter into suffering and to provide hope for you in your everyday life. And I'm so glad to welcome Dr. Kim Harms to our show. She is a former spokesman for the American Dental Association and the first female president of the Minnesota Dental Association. We are endued with royalty here. How you doing? Good to see you.
Thank you. Well, I'm doing well here.
It's great to have you. Well, I was reading through your bio, though, and I could go on and on. You've been on about every cable network and in every newspaper and all that. So it's really great to have you here. But what you really are, for the purposes of what we're doing today, is a trauma survivor. Mm-hmm. And you have quite a story that I'm sure that you can tell better than I. And it starts when you were born, really. Mm-hmm. So tell me about that and tell me what God's been doing and kind of walk me through the stages of your life.
Mm-hmm. Sure. When I was born, first of all, my father was in the military. I was born at Fort Ord, California, and my mother was a hand model, and my dad was in the military. And when I was born, the first thing the nurse said when I was born was all 10 fingers and toes. But then a few minutes later, she discovered she had miscounted, and I was missing 3 fingers. And at the time, we didn't know why. We didn't, and it was, of course, in my mind now, as a 64-year-old, a relatively small problem. But at the time, whenever you have a child that's not perfect, it was a big problem in the mind of my mother especially. And my mother was a great mother. She was a godly woman. She was a loving woman. She also suffered from depression. And so we went through some things as you could guess with that, including one time she had gotten so depressed after my father divorced her that she sat all 3 of us, my brother, sister, and I. She sat on a railroad track in Missouri and waited for a train to come. She
all
just
3
wanted
of you?
us, all 3 of us, with
Wow.
her. And she did so because she just felt she couldn't live any longer and didn't want us to suffer. And I know that sounds a little crazy, and it was, because she was suffering from an emotional illness. Luckily, she got off that track before the train got to us. But that's how deeply depressed she was. And I really want to point out that even with those things, even with that story, she was the most amazing mother I could ever ask for. She was loving and kind and caring, and she taught me, most importantly, to trust in God in all things, the most important thing I could ever learn. When I was 6, my dad called my mom, and they had just found out that in Europe, a number of babies had been born with missing limbs, arms, legs, fingers, and it was due to a drug called thalidomide, which women were taking as a anti-nausea drug. And he went to tell my mother that, of course, it was her fault that I was missing my fingers. And as a kind, caring, compassionate mother, who was suffering from depression, that was a little too much for her. And she ended up going into a mental hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she stayed basically the rest of her life. And we went to live with my father and my stepmother, which was not a good combination. My father forgot to tell my stepmother before she got married that he had 3 kids, so you can imagine that she was not real happy to inherit 3 of us. She was pregnant with her first child, and my dad went off to command a ship somewhere out in the ocean. So you can imagine that start would not be a good one, and it was not a good situation. When I was 17, my mother took her own life. Her depression had gotten the best of her, and she took her own life. She sent us all cards that said, "All my love, always, Mom," which I still have. That's the thing she left us before she died. And at that time, my world was destroyed, I thought. And so I went into a depression.
Yeah, how
in
do you
college.
process that when you're 17?
It's very difficult. And at 17, you're at that age where you're looking at life in general. You're looking, it's such a difficult age emotionally anyway. And then to lose your mom to suicide, my plan was to become a psychiatrist and find a cure for my mother. That was a plan for my life. So I had, was living for my mother, and now she was gone. So it was a very, very difficult time, but God is always with us, and so a few months later, when I started at University of Maryland, I met a man named Jim Harms at a softball game. He would tell you that he hit 3 doubles, and I thought he struck out 3 times. We really can't remember, but anyway, we met at a softball game, and he wanted to go to dental school, and being, a woman of the 70s, and now I wasn't going to become a psychiatrist because my mom had passed away and I couldn't save her anymore. So I thought, well, that sounds like a good job. And maybe, again, I'm a woman of the 70s, he'd marry me if I had a good job, right? So, so I decided to go to dental school. And of course I had to, when I went to my first advisor, and said, well, hey, can I go to dental school? And I'm missing some fingers. And he said, no way. Are you kidding me? They're not going to take you into dental school with 3 fingers or with 7 fingers. That's crazy. And I thought at the time, okay, I'll have to find another way to get Jim to marry me. And as I was leaving, though, this advisor said something that just changed my life again. He said, but maybe if you were a man. I remember this was the 70s.
Oh, boy.
And so when he said that to a 17-year-old, you better believe I was going to find a way to get to
that'll
dental school. Right, that's right. That
engine.
got me going. That got me going. So I went, found another advisor. She was terrific. It turned out I got into dental school early. Jim was going to dental school. We ended up in the same class, and went to dental school with Jim. We were married. So my plan worked. Going to dental school, my ultimate plan worked. And we practiced together. We graduated in 1981, so from then until, about 10 years ago, we practiced together for about 30 years. And things were going along well. My life was moving ahead. I was president of the Dental Association. I was on the school board. I was very active. We had we made every one of the kids' ball games. We just had a great family life.
And had you, at this point, dealt with your mother's suicide, or... was that kind of compartmentalized, or where were you with that?
That was compartmentalized. And it was compartmentalized because I don't think I knew how to grieve when I was 17. And so it was still there, and it was in the background. And in 2007, Jim was diagnosed with liver cancer. And of course, I went and checked out on the internet what his odds were of living, and it was 5%. But 6 months later, miraculously, he got liver transplant, so that worked out. But 6 months after that, on January 31st of 2009, 45 minutes after a breakup with his girlfriend, my only son, Eric, took his own life. He was a student at Columbia University, brilliant. He had just had the best first semester ever. He was on the dean's list. He was on the student council at Columbia. He was playing in the jazz band. He was a jazz pianist. He just was having the best time. But his girlfriend broke up with him. He didn't know how to handle that. And again, 45 minutes later, he was gone. And at that point in time, our worlds shattered into pieces. I did not know how to process that at all. And of course, then it brought back my mom.
Of course.
And so what did my mother and my son have in common? Me. So the guilt.
The common denominator.
Common denominator. I felt guilt about my mother's death. Maybe I could have saved her. I felt guilt about my son's death. How could I have helped him to know how to manage these situations in life? And we both fell apart, Jim and I.
The one thing I would say before we go any further, and I pray that if you're listening that this will never happen to you, but I want to just try to explain for a moment what it feels like when your child dies unexpectedly. Your world virtually stops turning. You can't breathe. You are, for a while, you can function in shock mode because you have to, and then everything just turns into a fog. And it's a feeling that you can't describe unless you go through it. It's different than any other kind of death, but it's devastating And now you're dealing with that, and you're dealing with the suicide element, and here you are in the middle of another suicide, and here comes shame and guilt, right?
Shame and guilt are the devil's most dangerous weapons. They use that in fear. And those things were all involved and intertwined. And, I didn't want to go on anymore. Didn't know how to. I didn't know how I would get up in the morning. You just described it. You can't describe it. It's too horrible to even describe in words. I did have something that helped me maybe about a month or so after Eric died. We'd been back at work, and I went outside of the dental office. Jim was with a cousin who had lost his brother at about 17. And his parents had never processed the grief. This was probably 30 years later. His parents had never processed the grief, and they were estranged. And he came to me, and he had tears in his eyes, and he looked at me, and he said, "Kim, don't you ever let your remaining children think that they are not enough." And that changed my life as well. Now, first of all, if anyone else had said that, I would have wanted to punch him in the nose, because that's, you don't judge my grief. Don't judge what I'm going through. But I knew his situation, and it really went into my soul that when you're going through a grief process like this, and you have to process through it and get through it, but you also have to realize its effects on the people around you. And Jim had just had a liver transplant. He was he was in that same mode you described that nobody can describe.
So that kind of snapped you into kind of a different reality, where you realized that you still had a mission. You still had to think about those around you. Did you just put your grief aside then, or did you deal with it differently?
I did what most of us do when we have grief. I put this fake smiley face on and try to process it in the back. God sent that was one of God's angels to me to tell me that, but he sent other people. I had a Lyndon Dungy, who's a brother of Tony Dungy, started writing letters to us, and we ended up meeting every Tuesday. He was like our own personal grief counselor.
Wow.
He was a dentist. He practiced right down the street from us. We had our pastors from our church that helped. But mostly I just tried to fake it until I made it, and it was harder for Jim to do that. He was more expressive, and one of the things that I learned was Jim and I were so different in how we responded and reacted to the grief. I couldn't go into Eric's room for 2 years. When the boxes came from Columbia, I couldn't look at them. They had to be put way down in the basement somewhere, a place I could never go. I just couldn't. When I saw pictures of Eric or heard his voice on tapes, I would just have a meltdown. Jim, however,
he wanted that. I bet.
He wanted that, so he would go into the room and he would listen to tapes and he would look at pictures. And we had to learn, I think, as a couple, to respect each other's differences and to work through that and understand that neither one of us was wrong in how we were grieving, but we had to realize that, try to work it so that as we were expressing our grief, we weren't making the other one worse. And so we learned to do that, which took a while. And I think that's divorce is so common after traumatic loss of a child, and I think we actually got stronger, mainly because we both were true believers that our son was. Although it took me a while to realize where he was, and of course when you lose a child or a loved one, the most important thing is, where is he?
That's the first question.
Where is he, Lord? And especially with the suicide.
And you walk around going, now he did get baptized, and Lord, I'm confirming this in my mind now, and you go through that process, and then God comes along and helps confirm it many times too through others, but that's the first question you ask. At least as a believer, that's the first question you ask. It's interesting too that you mentioned how people grieve differently, and here you are, a married couple, and you're struggling with that, but it seems that everybody in your sphere of influence knows how you should be grieving. And that's terribly frustrating and hurtful because they have no idea. Yeah. And so sometimes you just want to look at them and say, just be quiet. Right. And we just want to talk. We want to fix.
And I'm a fixer.
Yeah.
I have to say that I fall into that category, or I fell into that category.
Too. Sure.
We had one of our hygienists at our office that lost a son, similar to Eric, high school student. Girl broke up with him, gone within about within an hour or so. So she had lost her son to suicide, and I have to tell you, for all of those people out there that have found themselves in this situation, after a year or two, in my own mind, I thought, well, when's she gonna get over this? I mean, I fell into that category, and of course, when I was in that position, she was there for me, and I'm so ashamed of myself that I thought that. But I think that that's a common feeling. We just, because we don't understand it.
Don't understand it. And we can't expect others to understand.
No.
But what we can do is we can give people tools of what to say and what not to say.
Mm-hmm.
And I often tell people the best thing you can do is just be quiet, because what people who are grieving want is presence, not words, just presence. They'll ask you if they want something. And so here you are now. You've been through the suicide of your mom and now your son, devastating. How did the suicide of your mom kick into this now? What were you already talked about the common denominator, so you're kind of going, well, wow, it was me. I was here both times. Did you realize that the grief that you had pushed aside with your mother now was coming back and heaped on what you were feeling with your son?
Yeah, it was like a double tsunami. I was right in the middle, and it was like I couldn't breathe for probably about 2 years. I know that sounds horrible, but it was.
No, it doesn't sound horrible at all.
At least 2 years I was stuck in that, and I know that again, people knew I was recovering from my son's death, but nobody really understood the fact that this was a double situation. So I think that repressed grief certainly can come back and haunt you, and working through that is so important.
So your mom was a believer. Mm-hmm. Your son was a believer.
Yes.
After you began to get traction and could start to process that fact, how did that give you hope and comfort?
Well, first of all, I have to say I was so blessed to have a great church and a great pastor, because even at the funeral, he addressed that. I also want to say that God gave me the amazing blessing that we're Baptist, so it was our church is Baptist. Eric grew up in a Baptist church. I grew up Catholic, and Eric was going to a Catholic church, St. Thomas Academy here in Minnesota. When he died, now my mother was Catholic, and at that time, they were very kind of ambivalent about what happened in the suicide. Was she gonna? And nobody would really answer it, but it was we couldn't have it. Nobody would give a mass at that time. This was back in the
a Catholic
70s.
doctrine would say that
yes,
it's an unpardonable sin.
Yes,
right.
Yes, and so, but nobody ever said that to me. But obviously, if they're not going to give her a funeral, and that's how I felt. When Eric died, the Catholic St. Thomas Academy showed up at he wasn't even a student there anymore. He'd moved on to college. Showed up with the entire band came and played. Eric was the drum major at St. Thomas, so the entire band came and played at his funeral. Half of the church was taken up by these young men in full-dress uniforms.
Wow.
Who were showing respect for my son. When his casket was being taken out, they stood up and saluted his, which is I'm getting goosebumps now thinking about that moment.
Yep.
The Catholic pastor, the priest at the church, it just happened. Of course, God arranged that to run into him a few days later, and he was dying of cancer. And he said I was so shocked when I heard about Eric, and I just want to let you know he's with God. Just don't even have a moment's doubt. He is with God, and he said, and I'm going to be there pretty soon myself. And that reassurance from the Baptists and the Catholics, and the fact that they, everyone was doing this together, was a great support to me. And unfortunately, many people don't have that support. So I really have to credit my recovery from this with a lot of wonderful people that have been in my life to help encourage me and to remind me, of course, that God is a loving God and a kind and loving God.
So somebody might be listening or sitting here with us in studio to hear us talk like this, and they could say, loving God? What are you talking about? You just ran through a litany of things that I would never want to go through. So how can you say loving God?
I was at, shortly after Eric died, I was at went with some family down to Savannah, and we went into a church, beautiful basilica there, and we were just touring. and we went through the Stations of the Cross. And I'll never forget when I got to the one where Mary is taking Jesus off the cross. And I realized at that point that look at all the things she went through. And God loved her. Mm-hmm. He is a loving and kind God, and he loved us so much that he gave his son. I didn't give my son. I didn't choose to allow my son to die. He gave his son, and knowing he was going to go through what he did, his horrible death, for us. He loved us so much that he went through an experience that we can't even describe to save us. So because God gave his son to die on the cross, my son is in heaven. And that moment when I realized that, it made such a difference in my life. And I think we really have to remember that. The things on this earth are temporary. I'm getting older. As you get older, you start facing your mortality. But the things on this earth are temporary. And we look forward to this wonderful time in heaven where I'm going to see my mother again. I'm going to see Eric again. And we'll get to my husband just passed away too, so I will see him again. So that's, I know he's a kind and loving God. And what other sacrifice? I mean, there's not a greater sacrifice you could make, as you know, and I know.
Yeah.
And he did that for us.
Well, that's the fact that you can even say those words is a work of the Holy Spirit, and your faith is being deepened. And I know you also have a story with your husband. We'll talk about that next time. But I really appreciate your honesty and transparency in sharing your story with us today, because I think we all need to. I'm going to hire you, by the way, to come Christmas Eve at my church and give the gospel, because that was the gospel. And we have to all understand that we live in a broken world, but yet God is operating within this broken world with a purpose, and his redemptive story is ongoing. And sometimes it looks like we want it to, and sometimes it just doesn't. But it doesn't mean that God has disappeared. And so thank you for reminding us of that today. Appreciate it so much.